with some of the other climate science centers, so it's a pretty exciting series. Dennis Ojima is the university director for the North Central Climate Science Center, and I'm the USGS, or federal government side of the North Central Climate Science Center as director of that. So we thought, as part of the climate science centers, there's an interest in doing some outreach or education, and a neat way to do that we thought would be to have a seminar series. And so this is the first of those seminar series. My name, as I said, is Jeff Morisette. I'll be giving kind of an overview of where we are with the North Central Climate Science Center, basically talking mainly about what we're thinking in our 5-year strategic plan, or our strategy for doing science at the North Central Climate Science Center. A bit of discussion, maybe some slides related to research that's been done on that's relevant to our science plan, but probably mainly strategy and science planning. So more of a strategic talk than a science talk, for better or worse. So you could leave now if you that doesn't work. So I guess I'll just go ahead and get started. We do have a few people on the line. I just ask that you can hear okay, or everything's coming through and you can see a screen that's kind of got a Great Plains landscape. So if anybody's on the line and can't see that, or is having trouble hearing, just speak up. Otherwise, we'll assume it's okay. So this is a favorite quote of mine. It's by the architect who designed, among other things, Grand Central, or the Union Station in Washington, D.C., and somewhat inspiring in that I think that we have an opportunity with these climate science centers to do something bigger than small studies related to ecology or the big studies related to climate. We're finally connecting the big studies related to climate, connecting with NOAA, the other climate centers, GFDL, Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge National Lab, to then connect that data to, and that information, that expertise, to what we're doing with ecological forecasting or ecological response modeling and impact natural resource managers across the North Central domain. Let me see if I can advance this. Seems to be stuck a little bit. Let me just try again. So folks might have seen this that was published several years ago, Climate Change in Colorado, looking at the trends that we're seeing mainly from existing data, but then also looking at the projections that go forward with into the future. And I think the important thing to note, this is an example of Steamboat Springs in La Junta, Colorado, showing on the top the temperature and then on the bottom the precipitation. So there's two main things to note, I think, is that one, even the coolest temperatures in this monthly temperature, monthly average, are warmer than the warmest temperatures today. And that's consistent across the year and in both of those sites and all the sites they looked at. The other take-home message is precipitation with respect to modeling. There's obviously significant noise in that projection, that forecasting, well within the variability of existing data. So the bottom line is, it seems there's strong agreement that things are going to get warmer across the year, and actually getting a little bit warmer in the hotter parts of the year. As you see, we go beyond the natural variability in the warmer months, and we're sort of within it, but still warmer during the cooler months. But that precipitation is yet sort of fairly variable within the natural range. Related to that, not just the study in Colorado, but the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC reports, generally show that across the globe. It's going to get warmer. Precipitation is fairly variable, the forecast of that. And so with that, Secretary Salazar, back in 2010, early 2010, established an order that established what are now the climate science centers and the landscape conservation cooperatives. And that's to apply scientific tools to increase our understanding of climate change with respect to the impacts on tribes, and that was a big part of that secretarial order, is to bring in the tribal lands, and that's why we do have a tribal representation as part of the seminar series. And then also the land, water, ocean, fish, and wildlife, and cultural heritage managed by the Department of Interior. An interesting thing about this secretarial order, and if you look it up online, you can find it fairly easily, is that the first 2 paragraphs deal almost exclusively with energy and energy production. And so I want to have the North Central Climate Science Center direct itself to understanding energy resources, that interaction between, sort of that 3-way interaction between energy resources, ecological impacts, and climate, and where things are going with climate. So it's an important part of the secretarial order, and so we're bringing it into our plan, and we're specifically saying resource management, not exactly natural resource management, and not excluding energy resource management. So generically, resource management as the targets of what we're looking at doing in the North Central Climate Science Center. Another thing to note is just the vast array of issues involved with the climate when you're talking about the entire country. So I think we're a bit fortunate with the North Central to have a fairly more limited or tight domain in terms of ecology, although ecologists in the North Central or Great Plains might say it's not at all easy. So this is a slide that I took from, well, kind of using words from a National Academy Press report related to weather satellites and weather prediction and moving from research to operations, and some points that were learned from that process that really started unfolding in the 50s with the first satellite weather measurements to this report coming out in 2000, seeing how that was. And that a strong research program, healthy infrastructure and transition, interface with the user community, and a continuous evaluation process. And these are recommendations from that guide document that we would be using as we go into the North Central Climate Science Center and what we're going to be doing. The other thing about this, crossing this valley of death from science to application, I believe a way some people have asked, or a lot of people, if you're familiar with the landscape conservation cooperatives, which are part of that same order and mainly run by Fish and Wildlife Service or Bureau of Reclamation or Bureau of Land Management, that they sort of, it's a spectrum, and we're both doing some science and both doing applied work, but that the landscape conservation cooperatives are more on that applied side of that spectrum, where the climate science centers are more on the research side of it, but there is some overlap between the two. One of the elevator speeches or the quick summaries that I give as far as why we need climate science centers, what we're trying to do with these, is the antidote about in the Colorado River and the Colorado River Compact, based on some tree ring analysis that was done in part by Steve Gray, who's now the director for the Alaska Climate Science Center, looking at that, the precipitation or stream flows, river flows in the Colorado River through paleoecology and those tree ring analysis, found that this period right here was sort of fairly anomalously wet, but the Colorado River Compact was based on about a 10-year average in about 1922. So it's kind of an easy story to say, best intentions. This didn't have anything to do with IPCC and climate forecast. They looked at what had happened. They went 10 years back, and they decided what stream flows would be and how that should be allocated across the states into the Colorado River, which is why there's a bit of an issue when you get to where it meets the ocean in Mexico at this point. So the idea is not so much, not just climate change and it getting warmer and possibly drier, but understanding that what I call non-stationary nature of climate. That is, if you take an average, the area on which you average over will change the answer that you get. That's kind of the layman's term of non-stationarity. There's not a solid average that's moving across. So we need to respect that, and I think that looking at both paleoclimate and long-term trends as well as forecasted in the future can help resource managers to respect that non-stationary nature of climate. I think anybody that's making a decision, whether it's a forest management plan or a Park Service cultural resource plan, if anything related to average temperature or average precipitation is influencing that plan, they need to carefully think about that and where they're getting that average and what it means. So that's one of the operating principles that we have. So the diagram of the 8 different climate science centers is here, showing the circles representing the different universities that make up the university consortium within those climate science centers. Going back to that Academy report of having a strong research foundation is fundamental, as based on that research to operations document and what we're doing in the Climate Science Center. So all these Climate Science Centers are hosted at a university and bring in other universities through a consortium. So Colorado State University is the host, but there are also 8 other universities, 9 in total, for the North Central Climate Science Center. This is a map of the federal lands in the U.S. One of the facts I like to note is that the Department of Interior manages roughly 5 million acres. Now, granted, a lot of that is up in Alaska, but if you rated countries by size and acreage, there'd only be 13 countries that have more land than the Department of Interior manages, or I believe it's the 94th percentile of countries. So 94% of the countries are smaller than the land managed by the Department of Interior. So we definitely have a lot of land and a lot of and a great ability to manage that land and to respect climate change and incorporate in the management of that land. Specific to the North Central domain, which is sort of roughly defined by these 7 states, there is some ability to not have those boundaries be hard and fast if someone's doing a snowmelt study and it kind of extends west, or a Colorado River that maybe extends south and west. We're certainly able to consider that as part of what the North Central Climate Science Center is looking at or considering, but in general, it's these 7 states and those federal lands on those states. There's quite a bit of Native American lands within those 7 states. I'm not sure acreage-wise which Climate Science Center has the most, but we do certainly have quite a bit. As you might hear from Bob Goff when he gives his presentation with the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy, you'll have a map, probably, I'm guessing, with the rivers, and you'll see that wherever there's a dam and the flooded inundation, that's usually where the tribal lands are. And his idea of flood control is your land is flooded and the government's in control. So I like the way he says that. But so there's a lot of interaction between the Missouri River basin and the Missouri River, the flooding, and the hydropower related to the tribal lands. So I've got to get that slide from Bob because it shows this connectivity between the rivers and those tribal lands. Very interesting. The other thing, kind of regionally specific, is how dry it is. And anyone who's lived or worked around here, especially this past year, knows that precipitation and the kind of water balance, that is kind of the evapotranspiration and the vapor pressure deficit, is a significant driver of the ecology in this region. It's, as I showed in that previous slide, it's the most variable and uncertain when it comes to climate models and forecasting that out. Related to, I mentioned the climate, the landscape conservation cooperatives. There's 4 that we're focusing on. So this is a slide if anybody's working with any of those landscape conservation cooperatives: Great Northern, Southern Rockies, Plains and Prairie Potholes, and the Great Plains. That's just kind of another thing to set the context of where we are. Here's a more detailed, although fuzzy, slide of those university consortium members. That's not just Colorado State University, but these 8 others. The interesting thing is just down the road is the University of Wyoming Supercomputing Center, which is an NCAR facility being built at University of Wyoming, and that's going to be an interesting thing for us to be able to take advantage of or to collaborate on. Fairly sizable supercomputer. So continuing with kind of some context setting for what we're doing is we've established 5 operating principles, and as even further background, I should say that this 5-year science strategy that I am talking about has been vetted with our stakeholder advisory committee, sent to them for review, and come back to us. And I see the Climate Science Center as kind of being a 3-legged stool. It's funded and run out of the U.S. Geological Survey. So in part, it's the research and resources available through the U.S. Geological Survey, the university consortium that I just showed, and the research that comes out of that, and the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. And those are federal, it's representatives of federal or state or tribal governments that review our plans and make sure it's relevant to their management practices. So they are the users, so to speak, for the work that we're going to be doing. And in the process of working with the University Consortium, USGS members, and the stakeholders, we've developed these 5 principles. And so the first one is kind of don't reinvent the wheel, take advantage of what's been done. That's like that National Academy report, research to operations, and other things that I'll show a little bit here as we go through. One of the problems with that is there's a lot of existing documents out there, so it's kind of hard to respect them all, but we're trying to get the ones that are most relevant to us, but definitely build on what's been done. The trouble with our time is that the future isn't what it used to be. That we need to understand and demonstrate this non-stationary nature of climate. That is, maybe you don't want to go 10 years back, you need to go 50 or 100, or at least you need to maybe do both and see how much your answers differ. So if we can help people to understand that, I think we'll be in part successful. And I think that because of our stakeholders and our interest in year 2100 is not that relevant to land managers, next year and maybe 5 years out is. So we need to look at non-stationary nature of past and near-term climate. We definitely want to start with end users in mind. That's why the stakeholders are a big part of what we do. The 4th principle is probably one of the most challenging things for this center and other centers. That although I've had some folks say this is a wonderful opportunity to do a coordinated research effort across 9 universities connected to land managers, I have had some folks in the university consortium say, where's the solicitation? I just want to write my grant and get my money and leave me alone type of attitude. And I think that that is kind of where we are in maybe a paradigm shift in natural resource ecology management. That we've gone from researchers at university having National Science Foundation, maybe state agencies, maybe some NASA, NOAA has some big pots of money, USDA has some big pots of money, Department of Interior never really has as far as research opportunities for universities. On the other hand, USGS centers, as well as other Department of Interior centers, used to have enough money to cover the federal salary, maybe some loose change to pay for a field tech, collect some data, have your own study, buy your own equipment. Slowly, that sort of extra money went away. Now it's even, you got to fund 80%, you got to fund 20% of your salary, we'll fund 80, you've got to bring your own soft money in. So here the universities are, so the federal scientists are starting to look for money, and now Department of Interior is kind of getting into this game of working with universities for that money and how that money can work. So it's sort of, I think, one of the biggest challenges. I had an interview with the Government Accountability Office, interview audit, related to what we're doing with these climate science centers. And they asked me what they thought the most limiting thing or what the biggest challenges was. And I think that is it, is that we need to think about these things not as one-off projects that can go off, scientists either working with federal scientists or university scientists can go off and do. It's part of a collaborative, coordinated effort. And it's hard to do that without being heavy-handed or having people think you're being too top-down. You need to let good ideas flourish from the bottom up. But I would say we're not a mini NSF that's funding different projects. We're a coordinated research center that's going to have a staff that's going to try to supply information, tools, and resources that this other research can feed into. So that's a challenging one. It seems like a good kind of easy principle, but it's I think, a challenge to live into that. The other one is sort of like we all got to play nice and play fair, is that when you're dealing with universities, different federal scientists, and land managers, they've all got different constraints, rules, and issues to bring to bear, and we all just need to be patient and deal with that. So that's my kind of like the kindergarten roster when you walk in, no chewing gum, no spitting, no taking other people's toys. It's like, okay, let's respect what we're doing with each other. So this is one of those guide documents that we are trying to build on. It's actually award-winning in the Partners in Conservation Award from the Department of Interior, called Scanning the Conservation Horizon. It's what we ask the students who are part of the seminar series to read before the seminar. It's available online. What I like about it is it's fairly layman's term, it's fairly accessible, and it's being taught through the National Conservation Training Center's Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment course. So this is essentially the textbook for that activity, of which they've, according to NCTC, National Conservation Training Center, I'll just use that acronym. Hopefully that's not too acronym-centric as I move forward here. But NCTC has had over 300 participants in that climate change vulnerability assessment course. And so in a social network analysis type of approach, I think that if we work with NCTC and the people who have taken those classes, we really have early adopters, and we have some people that are interested in that. So in my opinion, it makes a lot of sense to follow where NCTC is leading with bringing those land managers in and then providing a resource and understanding what they're teaching them, and then maybe build on what they're teaching them. Figure 1.1 from that document has a nice diagram, and I think there's been some updates related to this, but it shows, I think, a fairly nice cycle of define management targets, do vulnerability assessment with respect to climate change, and certainly, you know, other land management could be vulnerability assessment with respect to land use, land cover, other demands, human influences, anthropogenic forcings, as well as competition, or, you know, there's other things that come into play for that second bullet point, but in this context, climate change. And then identify management options relevant to that, and then implement those. And so what I think the way I see another way of dividing that research and operations spectrum across the climate science centers and the landscape conservation cooperatives is to look to our stakeholders and the landscape conservation cooperatives to lead the first and fourth element of that figure, and for the climate science centers to lead the second and third components of that. And there's intentionally a lot of overlap between the two because they should certainly not be done in a vacuum, and there's certain things that identifying management options, I'm sure the stakeholders can lead some of those activities. So I use the term lead loosely, but I think in general the climate science centers fall on points 2 and 3, and our stakeholders and the landscape conservation cooperatives fall on 1 and 4. Related now, this is going a little bit into the research component of what I've done or what I've seen done at CSU. I've worked with Tom Stolgren and Sunil Kumar, and Barry Noon is starting to work with us, amongst others, to really get into, I think, the idea of this vulnerability assessment and how it sort of seems kind of good. Yeah, well, obviously climate is impacting natural resources, but actually quantifying that and really getting into understand that. So this is a diagram from that same report, and I think it's an IPCC vulnerability assessment diagram showing that vulnerability is related to potential impact and adaptive capacity. Shown in orange of the boxes are more intrinsic to the management target. And by management target, it can be wind power, it could be a habitat, it could be a species, it could be an ecosystem service. So it's kind of species, landscape, ecosystem, or ecosystem service. But that the orange is more intrinsic to that target, and then the blue is more external or coming on to that. But that's sort of a wire diagram that I could probably have a better graphic for if I practice some of the things that Matt showed us in the last seminar series about how to do better graphics and sticks and figures. But I kind of took it from the document, so I don't want to be too, didn't want to vary too much. But I think that species distribution modeling gives us a strong way to connect climate and climate vulnerability to to understand what's influencing a species. And we could probably have, and I think we've had a whole seminar, not just a whole talk, but a whole seminar series about species distribution modeling. So there's a lot of issues related to this, but in general, I think that, when you look at species distribution modeling, or even occupancy modeling or other ecological response modeling, you're observing something in the field, you're relating it to predictor layers or some wall-to-wall coverage of something that is related to that, what you've observed in the field, using some sort of statistical, machine learning, or mathematical procedure to relate those two, and then having a map that shows kind of where you expect whatever it is you observed in the field to occur. And so when you have, if you bring the climate data into that as a predictor layer, you start to understand where climate is influencing it. One of the things we're focusing on, and I call generically climate derivatives. Generally, there's not many oranges in Florida that care about the average temperature. It's when it gets below freezing. And there's many snakes in Florida, or there's pine beetle here, that the average temperature and precipitation are generally not influencing the plants and animals or the targets that we care about. So there are a host of what I call derivatives. So you can have a heat stress index, the number of nights that went above 90 degrees or 100 degrees, the number of days below freezing, growing degree days. These are all, I think, climate derivatives, and that on the impacts modeling side is what we need to focus on. And there's actually, USGS has a derivatives portal. It's pretty nascent, and I think it's even just sort of beta testing, but to create climate derivatives and then serve them up to people. Here's 19 that we use quite a bit at the USGS Fort Collins Science Center, and that work that I've mentioned I was doing with CSU, a diagram of these bioclimatic variables. There is certainly, bioclim 1 is the annual mean temperature, but there's also the kind of a range of how much the temperature varies throughout the year, and then seasonality, and then kind of temperature in the warmest month and the temperature in the coldest month. There's also 4 of them specifically related to precipitation, and 2 based on the whole annual record of precipitation, but then related to the wettest month and the driest month. And then what I think are interesting is that we see sometimes these interaction terms, like how warm it was during the driest month or how cold it was during the warmest month, or vice versa. All those are kind of interactions between temperature and precipitation and tend to be pretty important when you look at species models. So this is a diagram from the Yellowstone Ecosystem Research Center, Bob Crabtree at Yerk, constructed, that tries to show that habitat modeling. And as I said, there's been seminar series about this, so it's probably a review for a lot of people. But basically, what you do is you construct an array of, he's got collared animals in Yellowstone, and then he's got their elevation or their location in X and Y coordinates. But then you drill through all these predictor layers at that particular point, shown kind of with the red row there. You'll have how many small mammals, what's the percent of herbaceous and elevation, and then come up with a predictive model of what's going on with that, whatever your collar ID or maybe elk locations. I'm not sure what that was. So that is sort of a more attractive figure than my plain kind of box wire diagram. But to say that species location, you know, currently is a function of these predictors, and these predictors are somehow aggregated before today, some sort of less than 2012, and that you're trying to predict species location in 2012, and you use those predictors. I think an interesting thing for us in the species distribution modeling community is to think about the predictors, species location 5, 10, 50 years out, is being a function. You can borrow that same function. So this would be F1 and kind of F1. The function remains the same. But what you then plug into the predictors for that function would be the updates related to where you're going to be in 5 or 10 years. Clearly, elevation, we're just going to trust, doesn't change all that much unless the Yellowstone caldera blows, and then it won't really matter. But you know, we can assume that some things are static, and a lot of stuff in species distribution modeling assumes things that are static that really probably aren't, like land cover or kind of road networks, trails, different vegetation types. It's been easier, I think, when you go to use climate because of IPCC and the work they've done to have future predictors for climate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about land cover, land use, and vegetation state and what we can do about forecasting those. But before I do that, I wanted to remind myself that it's interesting to note that a lot of the times climate is brought into it. I've done it, we've done it. I think you can see in the literature quite a bit of, I don't know if it's called mismatch or it's just maybe something we should think about more carefully, that if you observe field observations in 2005, and because you have it available at your lab, you've got the average PRISM climate data from 1950 to 2000, and you use that for your species distribution modeling. So you've used an average from 50 to 2000 for data from 2005. And one, that's sort of a little bit of a mismatch, but probably pretty consistent. But two, I think more importantly, is not respecting that non-stationary nature of the climate that you're looking at. So we're working on having a system that would allow us to say, okay, let's look at PRISM data from this year, 5 years back, 10 years back, 30 years back, throw those climate summaries derivatives, like those bioclimate layers, into the habitat modeling and see if the results change and respect that non-stationary nature. And I think that's going to help you figure out what you might do in the forecast and pushing it into the future. So that's something to be careful of. And this is just kind of a map showing how it does matter. So these were January minimum and July maximums, and the difference, temperature change, by compositing from 1980 to 2010 versus 1971 to 2000. So that's just, this is a difference map for the winter and summer temperatures. But basically showing, you know, kind of certainly a spatial pattern. This isn't just random noise as you take a difference between the two composite periods. So you're averaging over two different 30-year windows, and this is the difference between that averaging. So, you know, I guess, like, I think I have the bottom line is the time period which you average over does matter. So, you know, where does that leave you if you're taking field data from 2005 through 7 and comparing it to a 10-year average from 1990 to 2000 or a 30-year average from 1970 to 2000, and you're coming up with relationships between that species and climate. So just kind of a word of warning, we need to do a better job, I think, of that. So this, like I was saying, is fairly well established in the literature and work that's being done. We've even got something locally done here. Paul Evangelista led this with Sunil and Tom and Nick, of looking at, you know, current conditions. This is a species distribution map of pine beetle based on pine beetle observations, and then Maxent modeling with those bioclimate layers, and then coming up with that functional relationship, and then just applying it to two time periods, 2020, 2050, at two different emission scenarios. So that's sort of, you know, pretty much, I think, state of the art or accepted practice in the climate ecological response modeling community. Fit the model with current data, and then project that out using different emission scenarios to see what might happen. We've also done this for 2 emission scenarios, and this is the coastal Alaska. I don't have the full reference for this, but Catherine Jarnovich is leading that work, and we're collaborating with folks in Alaska to do that. But now, what happens if you use other predictors other than climate? Land cover, land use change, or vegetation variables. And there was a study by Richard Pearson's group, Jessica Stanton, I had the pleasure to meet her this summer, sort of showed these are the AUC sort of model accuracy for better or worse, or just quickly saying, you know, closer to 1 the better the model is, showing that when you included both the static and the variable or dynamic into the model, you end up with better models. So kind of a lot of assumptions involved with saying land cover is going to be constant moving forward, but finding that they improve the models. So the idea is you probably shouldn't just, let me see if I can back up. You don't want to just eliminate these from, because you'd have to eliminate them up there too, for your ecological response models. You probably do want to include them. And there's management context too, because if you're not bringing in, if you're doing sage grouse in Wyoming and you're not talking about oil pads and human disturbance, you're probably not going to be modeling it right. So you really need to kind of include those. But what do you do as far as forecasting them into the future? So there is some work that's being done, and Dave Theobald has done some of this land cover, land use change projections. And the EPA, in a report they have, basically used even emission scenarios and tried to predict what's going to happen with land use change going out to 2100. So there is some work that's being done, and I think we need to, and I don't have any real research that's plugging that into our ecological response models, but it should be done and could be. This is something, I think it was Sunil that brought this to our attention, was this another projection of land cover change by this Radeloff showing what's going to happen in the next 50 years. So the good news is there's research out there that can help us with it. Now it's just up to maybe the Climate Science Center to start implementing those. The other thing is vegetation state, which I think is more challenging, but even that has some prognostic phenology, as it's called, by Rito Stockley and the work that he's done. There's some research on that to try to forecast what's going to happen in phenology. And I would call phenology is almost like the vegetation equivalent of those climate derivatives. So you got vegetation kind of growing throughout the year, and you can take greenness and how healthy vegetation is, but phenology almost is a derivative to say what was the range in growing season, what was the productivity throughout the year, when did the growing season start, when did it end. Those are sort of time series summaries of vegetation growth. So I think phenology is something that's very helpful for ecological response models, and there is some work being done on forecasting phenology, some other work as well through an NC's workshop. I don't have a slide for it, but so there is some hope in there. Anyway, that's kind of some research or some ideas on that vulnerability assessment, step 2 of that framework. But then going back to kind of our strategic plan and our science plan is we want to build, as I was mentioning, that National Conservation Training Center. If people are going to be taking a class, you got land managers who are probably mainly ecologists by training, maybe not even that relevant, not even that much training. They might be, I'm not sure, but certainly not climatologists, and certainly not spending all of their time reading articles and learning about climate science and ecological response modeling. I think they get back to the park and there's somebody stranded up in the backcountry, or there's a pothole or something that they have to address and think about. And so if you think about folks who have those constraints and those other demands on their time, going to a 3-day training to learn about downscale climate, and connecting that to ecological response modeling and influencing that in your management plans, it's kind of a non-trivial set of information to dump on someone. And so what we're looking to do is provide a resource for people that are doing this type of work to follow up with them and maybe hold their hand and implement some of the stuff that they learned in those NCTC trainings. It's built on what we've done at the Resource for Advanced Modeling, which was Tom Stolgren's primarily brainchild, and then implemented with Tracy Holcomb, Catherine Jarnovich, myself, and others, and Sunil, in collaboration with CSU and Nick and Cam, sort of building a collaborative workspace where people can come and sit around a table and discuss kind of these complex topics and building them on. I think the best example I had, well, there was 2. We brought a state apiarist. We were trying to model Africanized honeybees, and they understood the genetics between African honeybees and European honeybees, and the European honeybees can store more fat. So you've gotten, kind of down to the genetic structure of a bee to understand that maybe we need to look at how long it is between any sort of flowering to predict where one's going to grow and where one's going to thrive and not the other. So that created a dearth. We did a growing season dearth, like when there's no flowering, as a spatial layer. So we constructed a predictive layer that was based on the genetics of the actual target. We never would have been able to come up with that layer just ourselves without having the people who knew about bees and what the difference is between European and African bees. Similarly, with the Alaska work, we didn't have a permafrost layer, and that was like within a few minutes of meeting with the people from Alaska. The weed managers who are spraying the weeds are like, oh, you need a permafrost layer. This is all going to be a function of the soils and the permafrost related to that. So we got that, and it helped the models. But the bottom line is that I don't think you should make these vulnerability assessments, these species distribution maps and models, without the people who really understand the species and what it's doing right there in the room. This is a technical component of how we're doing this. We're building VizTrails, which is a workflow management piece of software. It embeds other code into it. I don't know if I'm going to spend much time on that, other than to say if people are doing species distribution modeling or any of the land processes modeling, like the RESIS or the Century modeling or MC1 in any of your work, we're trying to fold any of those sort of impacts modeling into an integrated modeling framework. The technique we're using is VizTrails, or the technical tool we're using is VizTrails, but trying to have a framework that would explicitly show all the inputs that were used, all the outputs, and tracking basically the provenance of the results that you get. And that's not just good science, it's also a function of possible litigation or questions through the Freedom of Information Act or Information Quality Act, of which the USGS is commonly called to the map with. So you need to document your what you find and the results that you've got. So we think that this VizTrail software will help us get at that. It's also got an advantage. We've sort of went from, I think, spending 80% of our time on pre-processing and bringing things in to the goal, and I think we're getting close to it, is switching to the analysis side, really interacting with the stuff, understanding the model results, and focusing on those instead of the kind of the arduous pre-processing work. I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing. That kind of gives an overview of where we are, what we're planning to do, and talk about kind of the next steps or what we're doing. We do have funded work through 4 investigators. They're USGS investigators who are fitting into this framework of the National Climate Predictions and Projections Program through NOAA, or much easily said, NCPP, which is trying to enhance the understanding of those climate derivatives and what you're then inputting to the ecological response models to affect land management. So that big picture that I've been kind of talking about through our whole science plan for particular, for specific studies that are looking to do that. It's posted on our website, and I could go into it. It's there's woody encroachment, sage grouse, riparian recruitment, and one is just kind of a generic, how does climate impact the decisions in the plains and prairie potholes. So one's a little bit more generic. The other 3 are very specific ecological response model, and some specific climate data that are feeding into that. And we're going to see how that help and assistance from NOAA into that can work. The other thing we've got is funding that is not yet actually finalized, but should be with our university consortium. Again, going back to the operating principle of being a consolidated research center that's working collaboratively, we asked for a directed proposal instead of soliciting it. Instead of getting 10 different proposals, we got 1 proposal from the university consortium with 3 research areas. And they're basically fundamental climate, extreme events, as well as the hydrological balance across the north central domain, the impacts modeling of that climate, and then adaptive capacity and decision making. If we do have advertisements for 2 postdocs related to this area, the other, and that's primarily coming through what Dennis Ojima is leading that research area. Iowa State University is leading Research Area 1 in connection with that Wyoming supercomputer to do some new model runs there. Research Area 2 is led by Andy Hansen at Montana State University, but working with Barry Noon here, as well as others in the university consortium. So that's kind of unfolding work that is yet to be even funded, so not yet started. The other issue that we'll be tracking closely into the future is this National Conservation Training Center and the courses they're offering and how we can assist with that course offering and provide resources once the people have gone through 1 or more of those courses. It's not yet sort of discerned, but as of now, I don't think there's a strong connection between universities and NCTC. So perhaps through this university consortium-based approach to the climate science centers and what we'll be exploring with the North Central, maybe we can, I think, bring some academic research to bear and to assist with some of the stuff the NCTC program is doing. Hopefully July, they're going to offer a pilot on climate smarts land management, I think is their name of it. It's kind of rolling into vulnerability assessment and climate change with maybe scenario planning. And the Park Service has led the scenario planning work that's going on in Interior, but NCTC is looking to have a scenario planning class. But they're trying to do something that maybe rolls that into it. Maybe it's a 5-day class. We're looking to have a follow-on or a regional implementation of that, hopefully in Yellowstone National Park in August. So they'll have their first course of it in July, and we're hoping to spin it off to offer the same course, but maybe more regionally specific in August. And that will help us see what we need to do with those participants in the subsequent month to help them do that. So that's kind of a fun thing that we're going to be doing. Here's a picture of that resource for advanced modeling over at the USGS Center. We'll continue to use that, implement it as a collaborative workspace. Those 4 studies with NCPP, that jumps ahead automatically, and the University Consortium folks will be the ones leading who's going to be using that resource for advanced modeling. We also have currently set up a 24 monitor array that we're looking to utilize to have different displays of model output, maybe possibly 4 different emission scenarios and 6 different time steps, or just a high resolution map that's spread across all 24 monitors, but that's kind of what we're looking to do and integrate with those folks that do that. So I think that's it with the slide material I have, and leaves us enough time for some question and answers. So thanks for coming and listening. Any questions? We got the phone as well. You could just speak up if you have anything. Yeah.
For collaborators to take advantage of the resource for advanced modeling, are there guidelines or is there a process for applying collaborate using that infrastructure, the tools that you have available to you?
For now, it would probably be through me or through the Powell Center uses the RAM, so that's a USGS. You write proposals, you get into the Powell Center. There is some management at the USGS Fort Collins Science Center. Tracy Holcomb kind of arranges that. It's sort of available to use, so if you're collaborating with someone at USGS, it was sort of just that would be an entree. I'm not the gatekeeper, but if it's a climate science center topic that we're providing some of the data and software support for, then it'd be best to work through me so I can make sure that we've got some of the habitat modelers there and we schedule the time to compile as much as possible beforehand. That we try to get things kind of staged up and at least preliminary work done so that you can bring land managers into the room. You can show them the early results, and that's sort of that Alaska one. They looked at it and were like, oh, what about the permafrost? And so we had at least a preliminary map and then work with them for a few days, kind of maximize their time if they're traveling here. We're also thinking how we can make this more virtual so somebody can kind of just webinar into it. But probably if it's a climate science related question, interested in using it through the Climate Science Center, I'd be the contact for now until I get actually a staff, which will be several weeks, but hopefully not too long. But excited to use that room in the climate context. We're working with the Geodata Portal, which is a USGS entity, and NASA Ames, and we're trying to have those climate derivatives calculated or available remotely so that we can just pull them from different climate science centers so that you could do bioclim from any of the CMIP 3 or CMIP 5 model scenarios so that you get any modeling group as well as the emissions and the different derivatives, tweak those parameters and bring them into your habitat models. So that would be, I think, sort of a holy grail of understanding impacts and the different models, scenarios, and derivative parameters. So.
I was thinking of the Powell Center when you were talking about that, how the Powell Center works, and it's really great to hear that that's actually tied into that.
Yeah, they use that quite a bit. Yeah. Just infinitely clear, no questions. Yeah, Sunil has something.
Currently, when we are training climatic models for predicting current habitat for the species, we are using those, like averages for bioanalogy from 1950 to 2000, as you were telling. So I wonder if you use different time slices, although for current predictions will change, like 10-year period from 1950 to 1960, then something like that. So do you think instead of doing just one time slice, we should be doing 5 or 6 different time slices, or maybe 10, and then create an ensemble of those predictions and tweak the model?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what needs to be done, and to see how different the results are. So the question is how you slice and dice that climate data in terms of averages, and can you look at an ensemble model of the results? And I think that's very relevant to look at. And it's what the climate model and weather forecasting community does with ensemble models. They kind of don't know, and they sort of give you an ensemble. That's what we could start to do more on the impacts modeling.
There was a competition, and 5 group B was selected, but that meant set of universities that have created a consortium that are now sort of less easily engageable, or how does that work?
Yeah, good question, and a little bit before my time and out of my purview. So the national office, the question is like the consortiums that were formed were, there was a solicitation, university PIs led a proposal, and in that proposal you had a consortium, and presumably there were other consortia that were or were not selected to be part of it. As far as I know, maybe CSU led the only, at least main viable, because they really did bring in Dennis, and what he put together brought in NOAA, NCAR, and then as many people at the major land-grant universities. And, it's sort of, but it was writing a proposal, as we all do, and you're like, okay, it's due July, whatever, and, did we get a letter back from them? No, okay, move forward. So the holes in the consortium are North and South Dakota don't have any representation. The question, though, it kind of becomes difficult in the accounting and competition type of thing. We can't just say let's add North Dakota or South Dakota without then North Dakota School of Mines saying why can't I be a part of it, or why can't some other university in Wyoming or anywhere else. So you have to almost open it up again to the competition process. There were other regions that had more sort of equal, two big, at least two competing proposals, and they had to pick one, and it did kind of create a little bit of politics between the universities that were accepted and the universities that weren't, and that's luckily out of the north central domain. So that's not a huge problem where we've got almost like opposite camps or competition. We just, I think, primarily had this gap that there's no representation from North or South Dakota. There's some USGS centers that are working up there. I'm going to visit the Northern Plains Research Center in North Dakota in 2 weeks and try to make sure we tie into that. We're not sure, is there, well, it kind of unfolds in the solicitation process of saying the PIs have to come from a university consortium, but opening the door to other universities to be co-investigators to that. And I think that's sort of a way, maybe not entirely satisfactory to these other universities, but that is at least a way to allow for them to come into it. And it'll other federal agencies as well. So we're probably, solicitations will be something on the order of it. You've got to be a USGS center and partnering with the university consortium, PI, but encourage other federal agencies, other universities, grab the best people. So you're right, it's kind of one of these tricky things. You pick one, you've left someone out. And I do think that they will be recompeted. I think the plan is to have them recompeted at the end of 5 years, and we're just starting our third year kind of in November, December timeframe. So it'll be interesting to see. And yeah, we'll see what happens, but kind of the nature of doing something like this. And it is relatively new. I mean, there are some of the cooperative Fish and Wildlife Service co-op units at universities, but this is a little bit different flavor. So, yes?
You mentioned that a lot of times groups involved with this kind of research, they typically take whatever kind of atmospheric forcing data or climate data that's available, like you mentioned prison, for example. Is there any effort within your group to actually develop your own climate products that are somehow tailored more specifically to deal with or help answer the questions that you're interested in and to drive the kinds of models you're trying to drive?
Yeah, I think that what you'll see through, let me see if that shows up, that Research Area 1 is primarily looking at least evaluating any downscaling that's been done in this region, and maybe more carefully looking at soils, especially in agricultural areas, and how deep roots can go, and the soil layer and the moisture within that soil layer, more careful consideration of that, as well as the topography and its forcing and changing with respect to climate and the hydrological or the vapor pressure deficit as it goes across the region. So we are trying to do that and doing some specific climate modeling runs for the North Central domain. Chris Anderson at Iowa State University is leading that effort, that research area, and we'll be working with some of the other USGS efforts that have been going on. They're using the WRF or WRF model that they propose to do. They're not doing it yet, but they're proposing to do it. That's what, I'm too many names. And there's the USGS person who's using the WRF model who's done some stuff in the north. It'll come to me probably in 10 minutes. Stame, yeah, thanks. John Stame is doing some really interesting work with the WRF model. So at least there's WRF model. We can see, hopefully, the improvements that Chris Anderson and his group will integrate with what John Stamm is doing. And John wasn't at our strategic planning meeting. We had a meeting with the USGS and university folks back in Bozeman in May, but representation from his center was. So hopefully we won't be doing things that won't be reinventing the wheel, but I think there is consistency with that WRF model to proceed with improvements. Yeah.
I was just wondering, like in that example up there, you have these states in the lower 48, and the LCC, they go up into Canada, down to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you guys are collaborating with universities and other countries and kind of make it more of a North American effort, especially for speech distribution models.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen anything coming from our university consortium where they're bringing that. I'm certain that the people up in the Montana and the northern, even anywhere throughout our region, have done some collaboration with at least Canada lands or lands in Canada. Whether they're working specifically with Canadians, I don't know. I haven't seen anything, but yeah, I mean, you got to parameterize your model outside the U.S. for sure, like talking about the downscaled climate that we're doing. But it would get tricky with federal money to give that to them. But it certainly, if a proposal came in that had collaborators in Canada, I think we would only sort of, it would only up its preference as long as we didn't have to give the Canadian researcher money, because that's just it's hard enough to get it from one university to a university, let alone to outside. Although there can be subcontracts through universities that we don't really know about. But again, it's probably going to be just the pragmatics of it. Universities in the consortium, USGS folks, and then co-investigators would be kind of more open-ended.
Do you see that as a weakness? Like, do you think in the future that you might want to collaborate with other countries? Or do you think
we certainly want to collaborate with other countries, and we had some CSIRO folks from Australia who I think have done some really exciting things in adaptation and mitigation planning, and I'm actually working on a proposal to go there for like a month to understand what they're doing. So I think we need to. North American Carbon Program is a good example that brings in Mexico and Canada, and we're trying to leverage off of that. By the nature of being a regional context, we haven't done a lot, but I think that we absolutely need to take advantage of programs that do consider the bigger picture. I think most of the people on the university, or a lot of the university consortium members, like Dennis, Ojima, and others, Steve Running, are involved with IPCC and other international efforts. So like the regional assessment for the National Climate Assessment, which feeds into IPCC, Dennis is leading the Great Plains Regional Assessment for the National Climate Assessment, which ties into IPCC. So, just pragmatically, I think since I started the job as director in February, Dennis has been to North Korea, Mongolia, London, and maybe a couple other places. So there's definitely, and I think probably by having a university consortium, we're expanding that ability to plug into the international community. Just because feds are sort of like you got to, if you're taking international travel, you got to tell somebody 6 months ahead of time, and it really gets like, why are you going out of the country? You're a federal scientist. You're using federal money. It's pretty strong justification to do that. Whereas I think the universities have much more ties into the international setting and grabbing the expertise where it exists. So.
But at one point we talked about training people in habitat modeling and climate change assessment. And at that time you were mentioning we could open it to international
Absolutely.
participants. So that way, it could be informal collaboration.
Yeah. Excellent point. Wherever we can, and it's sort of not money shifting hands. We're doing a webinar, and somebody wants to call in from South America. Great. We could. And like I said, the CSIRO or some people have really led a particular theme. We'll try to take advantage of it. And then co-investigators would actually, in a more real sense, allow for that to happen. good point. We need to do that. Okay, I think we're on an hour, so I don't want to keep people from their lunch. And the students in the class will meet in the NREL